Hey everyone, this week we are looking at rights, citizens' rights, responsibilities, the history of rights in the UK, some of the issues that have come up or will come up in regards to citizens' rights. And this is our, I think, week 5 or 6 looking at democracy. And the reason why it's here, and this is an important point, is because a healthy democracy should have healthy rights for its citizens. Citizens should be aware what their rights are. The government should know what they can and cannot do to their citizens, and you should be protected from the government by your rights in a healthy democracy. And so the big debate regarding rights is to what extent do we have that in the United Kingdom? The image here on my right is to represent women's rights, because rights aren't just something that appeared one day in our country. All of these rights have had to be fought for and campaigned for by pressure groups, which links to what we've been studying over the last couple of weeks, but also by just kind of groups and protests and famous groups like the suffragettes and Stonewall, or even things like mini rebellions or major rebellions like the Civil War and things like the Magna Carta have all become part of the UK's journey to having rights. Because unlike other countries, Britain doesn't really have like a birth point. So some countries have a moment like where the country is created, like the American War of Independence created what we now know as the nation state of America. And as part of that creation process, they created what we call a Bill of Rights. And so Americans have always had rights built in from the very start, or almost the very start. Whereas in the UK, we've evolved over time. And so our rights have appeared slowly, and they haven't just appeared, they have been fought for. They have, and it has been a process. If you look up online, the definition of the word right, it says, the yellow box below me here, it says, it's a moral or a legal entitlement to have or to do something, which is why you hear phrases like people say, oh, I have the right to stand here, or I have the right to do this, or you can't do that to me, I have rights. Because you have the legal entitlement means that the law says that you have the ability to do something or to not have something done to you. And most of those rights that people talk about are civil liberties. That is a specific kind of a right. And they are the rights that you have in relation to the government. These would include things like the right not to be imprisoned without a trial, the right to the vote, to the right to stand for election in a democracy, and lots of other things. And you can Google that if you'd like to know more. But human rights is another term we hear a lot about, and they're far more broader, far more broad. So the things like the right not to be tortured, the right to education, the right to healthcare, the right to life. These general principles tend to be more broad, more vague, and then have to be enacted in some form of legislation so it becomes a civil liberty. And as I was saying in the introduction, the civil liberties in the UK, if I just move myself to one side, appear over time, and it is a long period of time. And if you Google, I'll show you a link in a second, but like if you Google the history of human rights in the UK or look for a timeline, there are lots of different bits that you can choose because they appear slowly and different rights appear at different times. So we can go back to Magna Carta in 1215, which starts to insinuate that the royal family doesn't have complete dominant control over the United Kingdom. Then we start to get things like, I think in 1659 or something, there's the Glorious Revolution that restricts the rights of the monarch even more. The other thing the Magna Carta does, which is the one above me here, is enshrines the right to a trial for people, and the king can't just arrest and convict for no particular reason, or the queen. There's other ones such as Somerset versus Stuart, 772, which abolishes slavery in the UK. I'm sure you've heard of the suffragettes, the suffragists, and with the extension of the franchise in 1918 going towards 1928. We then in 1950, after World War II, get the European Convention of Human Rights, which is a document drawn up after World War II in response to events like the Holocaust that basically says these are the rights that we believe that all citizens should have. The ECHR, which is the European Convention on Human Rights, which is a term I'm going to use quite a lot this week, is then moved into UK law in 1998 and named the Human Rights Act, but it is, for our purposes, it is the same document. It becomes part of UK law and can then therefore be enforced by UK courts, such as the Supreme Court. And then there's various others. So there's one here which is about the UN Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But equally, I could have put things here like the rights of transgender people, the rights of gay people, the rights of women, the rights of the Racial Discrimination Act, which I think was in the 1960s somewhere. You know, there's all sorts of different milestones. And I think one of the links which I would like you to look at is, which I've screenshotted here. If you just go onto Google and Google UK timeline of human rights, and then go for an image search, you can. I thought what was really interesting here is that when I just did this search, it brought up a timeline for transgender rights, a timeline for Jewish rights, a timeline for just human rights, a timeline. I think there was somewhere one for immigration. You know, have a look through, because different groups of people, different demographics see human rights differently because of how various legislation has impacted them. So there's one of your tasks. You can even pause the video now and do that if you like. Now, along this journey of rights in the UK, there have been a few key milestones which you need to be aware of as politics students. Most rights in the UK began as common law rights. Now, some of you are probably going, what is common law? And some of you are going, oh, I think I've heard of that. And some of you are going, I remember that. That came in the sources of the UK Constitution module. Common law is when a judge makes a ruling. It's not an act of Parliament. It is a ruling by a judge. But under the UK system, when a judge makes a ruling, that sets a precedent, remember that word, and therefore that ruling effectively becomes a law or a common law. A common law can be overruled by a statute law. That's one which is done by Parliament. But if a judge makes a ruling, that is a law. And most of our rights, citizens' rights, were enshrined under common laws for most of British history. And there's nothing wrong with that. It works, except they weren't passed through Parliament. They weren't all in one document or one place. And when a ruling was being made on a particular issue, the judges would have to then look at previous rulings, lots of previous rulings by lots of previous judges, and thought about how the current issue fits with all of these different previous kind of rulings. So it's a complex system that perhaps was not great for a modern democracy. So Tony Blair's government in 1998 puts into UK law the Human Rights Act, which, if you remember from the previous slide, puts the European Convention on Human Rights, the UCHR, into UK law. And because that is a statute act, an act of Parliament, that then overrides and replaces all of these common law rights. And so now you and me as British citizens can now clearly see, if we wish to, we can read this act and we can see what all of our human rights are. And then the Blair government continued with several other key pieces of legislation to increase and vary the amount of human rights that we have, including the Freedom of Information Act 2000, which means that you have the right to ask businesses, organizations, government organizations for information that they hold on you, or for information about how various decisions have been made. And this helps to kind of publicize how government works, how decisions have been made. And many of the scandals that have come out since 2000 have been because journalists and investigators have been now able to request information from government, and the Freedom of Information Act says that decisions can no longer be hidden. The most famous example of this was the MP finances scandal, which was when it was exposed that MPs had basically been fiddling their expenses for years and years and years and claiming huge amounts of money from the taxpayers. And this was revealed because of the Freedom of Information Act, because a journalist went to Parliament and says, I want to see the MP's expenses. And the law now says, because of the Freedom of Information Act, that that information must be given. The information was given, and the journalist went, oh my God, this is terrible. And it was publicized. And the speaker at the time had to resign as a result. And as you may remember from one of our modules, the reputation of MPs has never really recovered from that. And then we get the Equality Act in 2010, which brings together lots of the different equality legislation. I mentioned in the previous slide things like the Race Equality Act, Gender Equality Act, Disability Equality Act, and others. And the Equality Act was the idea that all of these different bits of legislation should come together into one single act to give clarity, equal rights, and protection for all groups, no matter what their particular demographic, whether it's age, race, age, race, sex, sexuality, whatever. I think there's a list in the textbook that spells out the different areas that it covers. So, in summary, rights in the UK are well established, and according to law, no group can be discriminated against. Now, that, of course, doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but it means that when it does happen, it is illegal, and theoretically, the police should be able to get involved, or the Supreme Court should be able to make rulings, and so there is a system here. So, looking at the question at the top of this slide, do UK citizens have rights? I think we'd have to say the answer is yes. And this is how those rights have evolved over time to the situation that we currently have. But I guess the follow-up question is, well, are these citizens' rights protected? So now we've got the Human Rights Act, and now we've got the Equality Act, which is behind where I'm sitting here with on the screen. Does that mean that all citizens' rights are now protected until the end of time? Well, technically, no, but maybe politically, yes. Now, technically, I'm talking about legally what that means, and politically, I'm saying, well, would it actually happen? Both are debatable, but look at what the paragraph at the bottom of the screen. Parliament is sovereign, as you know, which means it cannot bind its successors, it cannot bind itself. That phrase means that it cannot say, Boris Johnson's government right now cannot make a law that says in the future Parliament must do this or can't do this. Whoever is the current Parliament is always sovereign, always in charge, which means that although the Human Rights Act was passed in 1998, there is nothing that stops a government in 2021 from changing it, amending it, or removing it, as long as they have the majority in Parliament and Parliament votes for it. So there's nothing that, other than politics and democracy and the views of MPs, there is no inbuilt legal protection for the legal protections that you have. That sentence might be overly complex, but I hope you get what I'm saying. There is nothing that stops these laws being changed. To illustrate this, let's carry on with the paragraph. The UK Parliament has ignored its own Human Rights Act over terrorism laws in the past. So you may well remember, or you may be aware, that the UK has been attacked, sadly, on several occasions by terrorist attacks. And nearly always when this happens, there is then some sort of crackdown on people that are seen as suspects, which often infringes their human rights, which often then means that the courts make rulings and say, you can't do that, you can't infringe on these guys' rights. And often the government goes, meh, we're going to ignore it at this point because Parliament is always sovereign. Now, of course, we can then say, well, that's a good thing because it helps to protect the country. But we can also then say, well, these individuals who may well be innocent, their rights have been violated. On the counter side, I'm making a case here that our rights perhaps look a bit dodgy, but look at the bottom of the paragraph. Many refugees come to the UK as our reputation for rights is so strong. Yes, we have issues, but actually many people still look to the UK and say, well, that's a country that has significant human rights and they are well protected here. And the Supreme Court regularly makes rulings to protect rights. Some have happened even while we've been on this course. Do you remember the Uber drivers case that I put into the group chat, where the Supreme Court said that Uber drivers have to be given sick pay, holiday pay, those kind of things. I mean, it's a minor thing, but it's not a minor thing for them because it now means that their rights to holiday pay, sick pay have now been reinforced, and Uber will have to comply. So, to an extent, citizens' rights are protected. Now, one of the issues that comes up when talking about rights is the idea of individual rights versus collective rights, because this often comes into conflict. The rights of the individual are the rights of a single person to do something or to not have something do to them. So an example here might be, we talked about that, a terrorist suspect before. So the right of that person to have a fair trial, to not be in prison without trial, to the right to freedom and so on, versus collective rights, which is society as a whole, a larger group, the whole community. And often the rights of the individual can be infringed, that means taken away, to kind of protect the rights of the group. Or sometimes the rights of the group are taken away or not protected to help protect the rights of the individual. And let me give you some examples here of how this can work. Because pressure groups will often work on both sides. Like you might get some pressure groups that are very much looking out for the society as a whole, and some pressure groups that are very much looking out for individuals. And of course, society, to overly complicate this, society, which is a group, is of course made up of individuals. But this is why the ideas come into conflict. Let me give you some examples here. So individuals is the rights and freedoms of an individual person, and collective rights are the rights of freedoms of a whole group or a particular demographic, meaning like white people or people under 18 or something like that. So, for example, individuals have the right to freedom of expression. I can say what I want to say, you can say what you want to say. We often use the phrase freedom of speech. And you're probably aware that in our country, we have a right to freedom of speech, to hold our various opinions, to hold particular political viewpoints. You can support Labour, UKIP, Conservatives, Lib Dem, we have these rights. But what happens, so that's an individual right, but what happens if your individual right to hold certain opinions affects or impacts the collective rights of a particular group, for example, a religious group or a religious group's sacred beliefs? So if I wanted to start mouthing off against Christianity or mouthing off against Sikhism or Islam or something like that, and I wanted to really kind of say, not only do I not believe in these beliefs, I think they are disgusting or they are appalling, or I want to even insult a religious figure or something like that, should that be allowed? Well, my individual rights would suggest yes. Collective rights might suggest no, that the right of a religious group has the right not to have their beliefs insulted or offended or teased at on TV. Whereas the right of the individual would say, I should have the right to have any kind of opinion. Now, you probably have your own opinion immediately about which side of this debate you would be on. But I guarantee you that if we took this idea further, you would find exceptions where you might be on either side. What if the individual's right was racist? Would you still support their right to express it? What if their right was against a particular kind of demographic? What if they had extreme political beliefs, like Nazi beliefs or something like that? Would you still support their right not to do things about it, but to hold those beliefs and to express those beliefs? And then, but then at the same time, to what extent do you then say, well, actually, all groups should be respected? What if a religion has a belief that actually could be seen as harmful or out of date or archaic? Or what if a religion has a belief that says, well, you must never insult or criticize my religion? Does that mean that no individuals can ever criticize that belief or group? Or what if there are good reasons to criticize a demographic? Supposing, like the other day in class, we were having a debate about whether young people should vote and whether old people should vote. Is that conversation offending or offensive to collective rights? So I hope you can see how individual rights and collective rights can come into conflict. Let's move on to so I'm just going to give you a whole bunch of examples here. I'm going to try not to do them in as much detail as that, but I really want you to get the idea. Press freedom versus public figures' private lives. That should probably be round the other way. But like take the Harry and Meghan example, maybe. I don't know if this is a good example, but go with it. To what extent does the public have the right to know about royal scandals because it affects the constitutional makeup of the royal family, to which British culture and traditions are a part? Or to what extent do public figures have a right to say, no, that's my private life, stay out of it? To what extent do politicians have a right to keep their private business dealings and personal relationships private? Or to what extent does the press have the right to investigate them because it might impact their personal characteristics and make them suitable politicians or not? We talked about lobbying the other day. To what extent do we have the right to know if our politicians have been paid by lobbyists? That's their private lives, but maybe the press, in theory, has the freedom to investigate that and find out about that. Individual versus collective. The right to privacy versus protection from pedophiles, as an example. So when someone commits a crime, they normally have to pay for that crime. Could be a fine, could be a jail sentence, could be whatever. But the way our justice system works is once a person has paid for that crime, they are then invited back to rejoin society as normal citizens. And to an extent, Criminals or ex-criminals, and this is the important point, ex-criminals have a right to privacy. So let's say you did something when you were 18, 19 years old, and you get in trouble and you get punished. To what extent, when you are 30 years old, should you then be able to keep that mistake you made as a young person private? We can debate this one on both sides. Maybe it depends on the crime, but hopefully you can see where I'm going here. That is that people that have committed crimes should be punished. We would probably agree. But then people that have paid their debt should then have a right to move on. However, if you commit a sex crime, and this is why I've kind of got paedophiles here, there has been campaigns that people that commit sex crimes should be publicized, added to a register, and then local communities should be told when people move into a neighborhood. So let's say we make up a random person called Bill. Bill commits a sex crime or a pedophile crime when he's a young person, and then he pays his time, and then 10, 15 years later, 20 years later, he moves into a neighborhood. Does Bill have the right to be private and move on from his previous crimes, or should the local community be told that Bill has moved into the neighborhood in case that community needs protection or feels like they need protection? It's a tricky debate. I'm sure you're already kind of thinking, well, there's arguments on both sides here. Which side would you come down? The right of the community to know that there's a potential threat in the community, or the right of the individual to say, I'm no longer a threat. I've made these mistakes and I want to move on. It's difficult. The right to demonstrate versus the freedom of movement or the freedom or whatever. So, for example, you have the right to more or less go wherever you want around London, around Manchester, around Gerrard's Cross. But what if a large group of protesters kind of stood in your way and prevented you going into a particular building, or using a train that day, or say that train drivers went on strike or teachers went on strike? To what extent does an individual have a right to protest, demonstrate, go on strike, to make protests? And to what extent can they then infringe on the freedoms of the collective? So you're aware that there's a bill going through the other day. We were joking about it, saying that protests, can't be too loud. And some people feel strongly on both sides of this argument. To what extent does the group have the right to make their loud protest? And to what extent does the collective group have a right to say, we don't want to be inconvenienced by your protest? And I've probably got another one here. Oh, the right to strike versus community public services. So, for example, can doctors, can the fire service, can the police, can teachers go on strike if they feel that their rights at work are being infringed? Can those individuals go on strike, even though when those individuals go on strike, it will impact parents, patients, etc., etc. But probably the biggest example of individual rights versus collective rights from last year is, of course, and I hope you've already thought about this, is lockdown. It's lockdown. We have all been forced to give up our individual freedoms to go out and to meet up because of the collective rights of society to not catch corona or not spread diseases. And it was very interesting, I thought, when lockdown first happened, there was a general feeling in the country that, yes, we're all in this together. We should stay home, protect the NHS, save lives. We all remember the slogan. And there was a feeling, if you remember right, last March, last April, last May, that, okay, we're in this together, we're doing this, we are a collective, we are a community. But have you also noticed that as time's rolled on, there's been more and more stories in the papers and more of a feeling on social media of people saying, but I want to go out, I want to see my friends. The government is taking away my right to freedom, or my right not to wear a mask, or my right to open my pub or open my business. And there's been a pushback against the collective rights to the rights of the individual to be free. Because let's think about it. We all understand why lockdowns happened. We all understand that there are perhaps good reasons for lockdown. But let's be clear, lockdown is an infringement of your rights. And so you should, in any essay you're writing about rights, coronavirus and a lockdown has got to be in there. And you can support it, and you can knock it down, or a mixture in between. I'm not saying it's a good thing, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I'm saying over the last 10, 20 years of my life, this is the biggest change a government has ever made to infringing on their citizens' rights. So it's a brilliant case study, and we can definitely talk about this in class, to what extent the government should be allowed to infringe on our rights, even when there is perhaps a good issue for it. Right, I'm going to end this video here. I'm about halfway through this week's lecture, but just so there's a kind of a neat break in the video, because I'm aware that some of you had problems with saving your answers. I'm going to make a break in the video here, and then I'll carry on in part two.